Confirmation bias. This is a mental filter where your brain actively hunts for information that supports what you already believe. The term was actually coined back in 1960 by a psychologist named Peter Wason. He figured out through experiments that human brains use this filter as a shortcut to save energy. When you encounter new information, your mind does not weigh all the facts equally. Instead, it grabs onto details that prove you right and quietly sweeps any contradicting evidence under the rug. You see this happen all the time when people argue on the internet or watch the news. Two people can look at the exact same dataset and both walk away perfectly convinced it proves their totally opposite points. You easily remember the quotes that match your worldview, and you quickly forget the statistics that challenge it. This still matters today because our digital feeds are driven by algorithms that constantly show us we are right, making it harder than ever to see the actual truth. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut our brains use to judge how likely something is to happen. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman first described this in 1973. They found that when you try to figure out the chances of an event, you search your memory for examples. If a specific memory pops up instantly, your brain automatically assumes the event is incredibly common. You can see this effect clearly when people go to the beach. Millions of people are terrified of shark attacks. However, globally, sharks cause fewer than 10 unprovoked deaths each year. In contrast, over 1 million people die in car crashes annually. A daily car crash is an ordinary tragedy that barely makes the local paper, while a rare shark attack gets weeks of dramatic headlines. Because the shark story is so vivid and easy to recall, your brain tricks you into thinking it is a massive threat. This still matters today because modern media feeds our minds extreme examples, causing us to panic about rare events while ignoring everyday dangers. Anchoring effect. This is a mental glitch where you rely way too much on the very first piece of information you see. Once that initial number drops into your brain, it acts like an anchor. Every decision you make after that gets pulled toward it. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman first proved this back in 1974. They had people spin a wheel of fortune that was rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Then they asked those people to guess the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. The people who saw the number 10 guessed 25%. The people who saw 65 guessed 45%. The wheel had absolutely nothing to do with the question, but that first number totally skewed their judgment. You see the visible effect of this every time you go shopping. A store crosses out a high price and writes a lower one next to it. That high price is your anchor. This still matters today because businesses use it constantly in sales, marketing, and salary negotiations to control what you think is a fair deal. Survivorship bias. It is a logical error where you only look at the things that survived a certain process while completely ignoring the ones that failed. Back in World War II, around 1943, the military looked at bombers returning from missions in Europe. They mapped out all the bullet holes, which mostly covered the wings and the body of the planes. The generals wanted to put heavy armor on those exact spots to protect future flights. But a statistician named Abraham Wald stopped them. He pointed out they were only looking at the planes that actually made it home. The planes that got shot in the engines or the cockpit crashed and never returned. Because those destroyed planes were gone, their fatal damage was completely invisible to the planners. By only looking at the survivors, you get a totally skewed picture of reality. This still matters today because we do the exact same thing when we worship billionaire college dropouts, completely forgetting the millions of people who took the exact same risks and quietly went broke. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is a mental trap where you keep pouring resources into a bad situation just because you already invested in it. Your brain hates losing. When you spend time, money, or effort on something, you feel tied to it. Instead of looking at future costs and benefits, you focus on what you already spent. You convince yourself that quitting means those past investments were totally wasted. You see this happen when you sit through a terrible movie just because you bought a $15 ticket. On a massive scale, economists call this the Concorde fallacy. Back in the 1960s, the British and French governments realized their supersonic passenger jet project was going to lose money. But since they had already spent millions, They kept building it anyway, ultimately wasting billions over the next few decades. It still matters today because it clouds our everyday choices. Knowing how to quickly cut your losses helps you walk away from dead-end jobs, bad investments, and failing projects before they drain you completely. Halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where your overall impression of a person shapes how you judge their specific traits. The concept goes back to 1920 when a psychologist named Edward Thorndike studied military officers. He noticed that if an officer thought a soldier was physically fit, they automatically assumed the soldier was also smart, loyal, and a good leader. Your brain basically takes a shortcut. When you see one positive quality, like physical attractiveness, your mind connects the dots and assumes that person is also naturally intelligent, funny, or kind. You do not wait for proof. You end up trusting or favoring people based on a single good trait. A tall, well-dressed person walks into a room and you immediately think they are successful and competent before they even speak. This mental shortcut still matters today because it quietly influences who gets hired for jobs, who wins political elections, and who you decide to trust in your everyday life. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is a cognitive bias where people who are bad at something actually think they are great at it. In 1995, a man named MacArthur Wheeler robbed 2 banks with lemon juice on his face, believing it acted like invisible ink against security cameras. This bizarre event inspired psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger to study the phenomenon in 1999. They tested subjects on logic and grammar, finding that those scoring in the bottom 12th percentile actually believed they were in the 62nd percentile. When you do not know much about a subject, you lack the very knowledge needed to recognize your own mistakes. You literally cannot see your own incompetence. On the flip side, highly skilled people often underestimate themselves. Because a task is easy for them, they wrongly assume it is just as easy for everyone else. This matters today because it explains why so many people confidently spread misinformation online. A little bit of knowledge gives a false sense of absolute expertise. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the common psychological phenomenon where you believe an unpredictable event was completely obvious after it already happened. This concept was first clearly documented in a famous 1975 study by psychologist Baruch Fischoff. Before President Richard Nixon's historic 1972 trips to Beijing and Moscow, researchers asked people to predict the chances of different outcomes. After the trips concluded, they asked those same people to remember their original guesses. The results showed that people completely rewrote their own memories. Once they knew what actually happened, they honestly believed they had predicted it all along. When something occurs, your brain almost instantly connects the dots backward, making the outcome feel inevitable. You look at a sudden stock market crash or a rare surprise sports upset and think you saw it coming. This creates a dangerous false sense of security. It matters today because overestimating your ability to predict the past makes you terribly overconfident about your ability to predict the future. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is a psychological glitch where you adopt a belief or behavior just because everyone else is doing it. The term actually comes from American politics back in 1848. A famous circus clown named Dan Rice used his literal music bandwagon to campaign for Zachary Taylor. As Taylor grew popular, more politicians wanted a seat on the wagon to be associated with his success. Your brain does the exact same thing today. When you see a massive group of people doing something, your mind assumes they must know something you do not. Instead of stopping to evaluate the facts, your brain takes a shortcut and just copies the crowd. You can see this happen in real time when a random fashion trend suddenly takes over a city, or when a sudden panic causes everyone to buy all the toilet paper in a grocery store. It still matters today because understanding this herd mentality is the only way to catch yourself before you abandon your own critical thinking just to fit in. Framing effect. This is a cognitive bias where your brain decides on something based entirely on how the information is presented to you, rather than the facts themselves. In 1981, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman proved this by testing how people react to the exact same choices described in 2 different ways. The main trigger is whether a choice is framed as a potential gain or a potential loss. Our brains naturally hate losing things. So, if a doctor tells you a surgery has a 90% survival rate, you probably feel good about taking the risk. But if that same doctor says the surgery has a 10% mortality rate, your brain panics. You focus entirely on the chance of death, even though the math is exactly the same. You see this effect everywhere in daily life, like ground beef labeled 80% lean instead of 20% fat. This still matters today because marketers, politicians, and the media constantly use these slight shifts in words to quietly steer your decisions and shape how you see the world. Attribution error. Attribution error is a mental blind spot where we judge people's actions based on their personality while ignoring the situation they are in. Back in 1977, a psychologist named Lee Ross gave this glitch a name after studying how quickly we rush to judgment. When someone cuts you off in traffic, your brain automatically assumes they are a selfish, terrible driver. You completely ignore the possibility that they might be rushing to the hospital. But when you cut someone off, the process flips. You know you are a good person, so you blame the bad road layout or the fact that you are running late for work. Your brain takes a shortcut, using context to excuse your own mistakes while stripping that same context away from a stranger. The visible result is a world filled with hypocritical arguments and unnecessary anger, where we end up punishing people for circumstances out of their control. This matters today because recognizing this bias helps us pause, give others the benefit of the doubt, and communicate better. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is the human brain's natural tendency to notice, remember, and care a lot more about bad things than good things. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, early humans lived in a dangerous world. To survive, their brains developed a quick alarm system. If our ancestors missed a chance to eat a delicious berry, they just went hungry for a day. But if they ignored the rustle of a predator in the bushes, they died. So, the brain learned to process threats instantly and hold on to those bad memories to avoid future danger. Today, you see this happen when you read a performance review at work. Your boss gives you 10 compliments and one piece of minor criticism. You leave the meeting only thinking about that single negative comment. You might even lose sleep over it, completely ignoring the praise. This old survival trick kept our ancestors alive, but in modern life, it easily creates unnecessary anxiety, making everyday stress feel like a life or death threat.